Gotcha.
Alright guys, it's time to talk about the hunting horns. I'm going to be taking a look at the Queen Vespoid horn in particular. You know, after playing with the lance for about 90 hours, I started playing the multiplayer finally, and I noticed right away nobody uses the hunting horn, and it really disappointed me. You know, it is a support weapon, and I was really hoping to run into it a few times just to kind of see what it plays like. And when I realized nobody was playing with this weapon, I decided, you know what, I'll play with the weapon and I will give you guys feedback on my experiences and kind of just decide what it is that this weapon does best. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. Today we'll be talking about general ideas with the horn, but most importantly, we're going to be taking a look at this horn in particular and why I ended up liking it so much. Now I do want to note there's other hunting horns worth talking about. We're just going to be talking about the Queen Vespoid hunter horn because it's so easily available early on. So one of the things I've learned about Monster Hunter is a big part of the game is just building your arsenal of weapons. It takes a long time. You got to kill a lot of monsters. You got to have a lot of money, right? So the Queen Vespoid hunter horn has an advantage of offering really good recitals. And when I say recitals, of course, I'm referring to the buffs, right? It offers really good recitals, but also you can build it very quickly. You see, some of its previous upgrades, the earliest one is called Glass Royale, Rarity 5. You really only need to kill, these bugs, Vespoids, in order to upgrade it. So you can get this one very quickly. And right away you get access to those excellent buffs, and that's going to help you with farming most of the monsters and obtaining the materials to gather the other horns. Like right now, I'm playing around with the other horns, but before then, I was using the Queen Vespoid hunter horn, and there's still some monsters that I would strictly use this horn on. So we'll get to that later. Alright, well let's get started with talking about the equipment information. So, with this weapon, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have paralysis. It's not a hidden element. You just get that, right? So, you're going to be dealing paralysis. You get 2 decoration slots for lesser decorations. And it's also worth noting that hunting horns do cause stun. So, you'll be wanting to focus on the monster's head to try and get them to go into a stun animation. You know, monsters cause that on the player all the time. That's where you're kind of standing there, you can't move, and you have the stars over your head. Well, you can do that to the monsters using a hunting horn, so always go for their head. Now that we got that out of the way, what we really need to talk about are the recitals. Oddly enough, with the hunting horns, since they're not really the biggest damage dealers, what's really more important is what recitals they offer, because sometimes the recitals apply a really powerful buff that counter a particular monster. You even have situations where the attributes of the hunting horn themselves aren't really that important, but the recitals, the buffs, are extremely important. Like if you're fighting a monster who is dealing fire damage and you have the fire resist recital, right? But your weapon deals like fire, let's say. That's an example. So you're not going to deal very much damage with the hunting horn, but the buff that you apply to yourself and your teammates are going to add to your survivability a lot. So let's go over the Queen Vespoid horn's recitals. It gets stamina reduced large, all wind pressure negated, defense up large, that's a really good one by the way, ice resist boost large, and sonic waves. And what I'm going to do now is kind of break down how each one of those plays out and in what situations you're going to be using them. Before we get any further, let me just make sure you know this thing about hunting horns. Basically, when you apply the same buff a second time, it's a stronger version of the original one. And well, we call that an encore. So the original buff is a recital, and then when you play it a second time, it's an encore. Stamina use reduced is the recital. Stamina use reduced extended is the encore. So that's kind of how that works. And so I'll kind of be, when I'm talking about the recitals here, I'll kind of be talking about the encores as well, particularly if they're very important. Some of them are. So the first buff, Stamina Use Reduced, does exactly what it says. When your teammates are using up their moves or needing to roll, it's going to use less stamina to do that. How much less? I don't have exact numbers, but it looks pretty significant, maybe even 50% less. This is particularly useful if you're fighting Legiana, and Legiana applies the Ice Blight to you. It kind of counters the Ice Blight. And I have more to talk about with the Legiana as we go through the buffs, because there's another buff that counters Legiana. Now, one of the things I like about the Stamina Use Reduced is it's going to increase your whole party's sustained DPS. If they really understand how to take advantage of it, they're going to be able to use their most expensive moves as often as they can, or let's rephrase that. They're going to be able to use their most expensive moves more often, and that increases your sustained DPS while still giving you enough stamina perhaps to escape the monster, if whatever you're hunting, if it comes after you. So on the surface, even if this doesn't look like an offensive buff, kind of it is. Yet it's also helpful for players who need to be able to guard, players who need to be able to roll, and players who have been affected by Ice Blight. Next, we're going to talk about probably the most important recital that the Queen Vespoid Hunter Horn can play, and that's going to be Defense Up Large. And the Encore version is Defense Up Extra Large. I have a lot to say about this, so I'll try to be brief. Basically, in multiplayer, you have this problem, especially with strangers, not with friends. You have this problem where somebody on the team doesn't have a very good build, they don't know how to use potions or health, or maybe they're undervaluing their survivability. In this game, because the monster that you're fighting has so much health, you always have to prioritize your survivability if you want to consistently win. Now, there's going to be experts at the game that know every single movement of the enemy, right, of the monster, and they're going to focus on just getting their DPS as high as they can and being able to survive a single hit probably, right? But for the majority of players that are not experts at the game, they tend to undervalue survivability, and if it wasn't that way, they would win more consistently. So Defense Up Extra Large kind of alleviates that problem where you have some, dodo on your team and he is just going to be one shot right off the bat, right? And of course, once he's been one shot or two shot, that means he's lost his canteen buff, which means when he comes back to the fight, he's even more likely to die. See, that was a problem I was running into when I was playing multiplayer with the Lance. But once I swapped over to the Hunting Horn and I was applying Defense XL to everyone, I found myself winning almost all of my fights. It was like night and day how quickly it changed, because we had these teammates that would normally die, and you'll see them. What'll happen is they'll be hit real bad and they'll have a smidge of health left, and you'll be like, haha, that guy would have died if I hadn't applied that buff to him. See what I'm saying? So Defense Up, in my opinion, is one of the best recitals for any of the Hunting Horns, just because it's got so much utility for saving people who would have otherwise been one shot. And I think, again, that's probably the number one reason why you lose a multiplayer match. It's not because you guys aren't doing enough damage. You almost always do enough damage. It's because everyone tends to undervalue survivability in a long fight of attrition with a very healthy monster, a monster who has tons of hit points. The next recital is all wind pressure negated. Wind pressure is kind of like roaring. You have these winged monsters who will cause you to throw your arms over your head because they've jumped up in the air and flapped their wings really hard, and basically this cancels that. So in a way, it's very similar to earplugs, and I would say it's kind of one of the more valuable recitals in the game, just in general. So all wind pressure negated. Ice resist boost large. So if you notice, you've already got defense up, and now you've got ice resist, and you've got stamina use reduced. What does that mean? It means you've got 3 definitely useful recitals versus Legiana. Now, I don't know if Legiana causes wind pressure as well, but if it does, that's 4. That means this Hunting Horn pretty much fully counters the Legiana. So if you're off fighting tempered Legiana and you want to do it in a team, get someone on your team that is using the Queen Vespoid Horn. It will just totally neuter Legiana because of all of the buffs will be directly useful in the fight, which is really what you want with these Hunting Horns. You're looking to pair a counter build with the monster you're going to fight this hunting horn definitely counters Legiana. And finally, it gets Sonic Waves. So Sonic Waves, I'm not as big a fan of this one just because of how hard it is to use. But basically what Sonic Waves does is it works exactly like a Screamer Pod. If you're fighting a monster who's sensitive to sound, just like, for example, Diablos, you can use this to cause him to be stunned. And it has to be when he's vulnerable to being stunned. So for Diablos to be stunned by Sonic Waves, he has to tunnel underground and be underground when the move becomes active. And that's kind of hard to do because he moves pretty fast underground and he pops up really quickly. So you kind of have to start using it very early on in order to actually land it on him. Now I want to point out some things I observed. First of all, it doesn't appear to be something you can spam. I noticed I would use it once successfully and then I couldn't use it. It just wouldn't work on him right away the second time. So I think there's an internal cooldown to how often you can trigger this, similar to when you're mounting a monster. The other thing I noticed is if he's not traveling a long distance, it's very hard to actually land Sonic Waves on him because he pops out of the ground too soon, before it becomes active. So those two things make Sonic Waves a very situational trap, right? But it is useful. So the other thing I want to point out is if you're fighting Diablos, he does have wind pressure for when he's tunneling, and he's weak to paralysis. So this is another situation where if you're fighting a tempered Diablos, this is a terrific support weapon to bring with you for all of those reasons. Sonic Waves, defense up, stamina reduction, wind pressure negation, and paralysis all together. So Legiana and Diablos will be countered by this horn. If you must go into multiplayer and fight them, consider bringing it. But in general, it's also just a good horn because it has stamina use reduced and it has defense up. Alright, well that wraps up the Queen Vespoid horn. I am looking at several other horns right now. I'm sure I will have some videos out on them as well. There's so much that I could make a video on right now in Monster Hunter. Tons of information, a lot, like what armor do you pair with the hunting horn? At some point I probably should make a general guide for using the hunting horn, but I want to get a little more experience in before I do that to make sure it's a really good guide. And I hope you guys will be there when I do post that, and I hope I'll see you guys next time.
Really? Oh my gosh, you guys! I just want to thank y'all so much!